The crystal spires of Zilanian Prime trembled as another wave of destruction swept across the planet's surface. High above the burning cities, Admiral Kethara stood on the bridge of the last functioning orbital station, watching her world die through the reinforced viewing ports. The Devourers had come 3 cycles ago, and nothing the Zilanian defense fleet threw at them even slowed their advance. "Admiral." "Communications officer," Velan called out, his usually steady voice cracking with exhaustion. "The southern continent just went dark. That's the last of our military installations." Kethara's forearms drooped as she absorbed the news. The Zilanians had been spacefaring for over 2,000 years, had colonized 17 systems, and commanded one of the most advanced fleets in this arm of the galaxy. Yet against the Devourers, all their technology meant nothing. These creatures didn't use ships or weapons in any recognizable sense. They simply arrived, consumed everything organic, and moved on. Planets, people, entire ecosystems gone within days. "What about the evacuation efforts?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Velan's expression. "The transport ships. They didn't make it past the atmosphere before the Devourers reached them." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "There are no survivors on the surface anymore, Admiral." Kethara closed her eyes and felt the weight of her people's extinction settling on her shoulders. 43 billion Zilanians had called this world home just 3 cycles ago. Now she commanded a skeleton crew of 200 on what might be the last Zilanian structure in existence. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the other orbital platforms," reported another officer. "Put it through." The holographic display flickered to life, showing the faces of the 4 remaining station commanders. All wore the same expression of desperate resignation that Kethara felt in her bones. "We've lost contact with Orbital 7, Admiral Threnak reported from Station 3. "The Devourers have learned to project themselves into space. They're systematically taking out our remaining installations." "How long do we have?" Kethara asked. Chief Engineer Mordis from Station 1-2 consulted his instruments. "Based on their current rate of advancement, I estimate 6 hours before they reach our position. Maybe 8 if we're lucky." Admiral Kethara looked around at her crew. These were the finest minds and warriors their species had produced, and they had all accepted their fate with the quiet dignity that had always defined Zilanian culture. But accepting death and welcoming it were different things entirely. "I have a proposal," she said slowly. "One final option." The other commanders leaned forward, hope flickering in their eyes despite everything they'd witnessed. "The deep space communication array," Kethara continued. "It's still functional. We could send out a distress signal not to our colonies. They're too far away, and the Devourers will reach them eventually anyway. But to anyone out there who might be listening," Admiral Threnak's expression darkened. "Kethara, you're talking about revealing our position to unknown species. For all we know, we could be calling something worse than the Devourers." "Worse than extinction?" Kethara gestured toward the planet below, where fires now covered 3/4 of the visible surface. "I don't think that's possible." The debate that followed was brief but intense. In the end, desperation won over caution. They had nothing left to lose. Communications. Officer Velan worked frantically to configure the deep space array, pushing its power output far beyond safe parameters. This would be a one-time transmission. The array would burn out after sending the signal, but it would broadcast across half the galaxy. "Ready, Admiral," Velan reported. "The signal will reach approximately 40,000 star systems. If there's anyone out there with the technology to receive it, do it." The message was simple but urgent. "This is Admiral Kethara of Zilanian Prime, broadcasting on all frequencies. Our world is under attack by an unknown force we call the Devourers. They consume all organic matter and cannot be stopped by conventional weapons. Our civilization is ending. We make this plea to any spacefaring species receiving this transmission. If you have ever faced these creatures and found a way to defeat them, please help us. We are the last survivors of our people." Coordinates attached. The transmission burst outward at faster-than-light speeds, carrying with it the final hope of an entire species. On her screen, Kethara watched the signal propagate across local space, then fade into the cosmic background radiation. Within hours, it would reach the nearest inhabited systems. Within days, It might cross the galaxy. Now we wait, she said quietly. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. The Devourers continued their systematic destruction of the planet below. But they seemed to be taking their time with the orbital installations, perhaps savoring this final course of their meal. Every hour that passed meant their signal traveled further into space, reaching more potential receivers. Then, after 4 hours of nail-biting tension, something extraordinary happened. "Admiral!" Velon practically shouted, his excitement cutting through the bridge's grim atmosphere. "I'm receiving a response." Every head on the bridge turned toward him. This was impossible. Even the nearest civilized systems were at least 6 hours away by conventional faster-than-light travel. "Put it through," Kethara ordered, her voice steady despite the hammering of her hearts. The response came through in clear Zilanian, somehow perfectly translated despite originating from an unknown species. "Zilanian Prime. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Biological Survey ship, Darwin's Dream. We received your distress call and we're on our way. Be advised, we're bringing friends. Lots of friends. Hold your position and stay away from the planet's surface until we arrive." Estimated time of arrival: 47 minutes. The bridge fell into stunned silence. 47 minutes? That meant this Terran ship was either impossibly close or had access to technology that defied everything the Zilanians understood about physics. "Admiral," Velon said hesitantly, "I'm detecting multiple energy signatures approaching the system. They're coming from hyperspace, but the readings are unlike anything I've ever seen." Kethara activated the long-range sensors, and her breath caught in her throat. Dozens of contacts were dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of their system, but these weren't ships in any conventional sense. The energy signatures were organic, yet they showed signs of technological enhancement. Most disturbing of all, many of them were massive, larger than their biggest dreadnoughts. "What did we just call down on ourselves?" Admiral Threnak's voice crackled over the comm system, his panic clear even across the static. Before Kethara could respond, another transmission came through, this one from a different voice. "Zilanian survivors. This is Commander Jake Morrison aboard the carrier New Eden. We've got visual on your planet and confirmed presence of what you call Devourers. We've dealt with similar entities before. Beginning deployment of countermeasures now." On the main display, the first wave of approaching contacts became visible to the naked eye. What Kethara saw made her question her sanity. These weren't ships at all, they were creatures, living beings the size of space stations, moving through the void with impossible grace. Some had scales that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns. Others possessed membranous wings that somehow provided propulsion in vacuum. A few appeared to be massive jellyfish-like entities that pulsed with internal light. But most shocking of all were the smaller forms moving alongside these giants. Sleek, predatory shapes that reminded her of the deep-sea hunters from Zilanian's ancient oceans, but these were clearly adapted for space travel. They moved in coordinated packs, and Kethara could see that each one was accompanied by a small artificial construct, some kind of life support system. "Admiral," Velon whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I'm reading life signs aboard those creatures. They have passengers." The reality of the situation began to sink in. These mysterious Terrans hadn't sent a rescue fleet, they had sent a living armada, and somehow, impossibly, they had traveled across half the galaxy in less than an hour to answer a desperate plea for help. On the surface of Zilanian Prime, the Devourers had consumed nearly 90% of all organic matter. They moved in vast, writhing masses that defied description, consuming and growing, and spreading across the planet like a living plague. Nothing had ever been able to stop them, or even slow them down. But as the first of the Terran creatures descended toward the planet's atmosphere, Admiral Kethara found herself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, the Devourers were about to encounter something they hadn't faced before. Something from a world where evolution had taken a very different path. The orbital station shuddered slightly as the largest of the approaching creatures passed nearby, and through the viewing port, Kethara caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip a beat. Mounted along the creature's sides were structures that looked almost like cities, with lights and movement visible within them. This wasn't just a creature. It was a living ship, carrying what might be an entire military force. All stations, This is Admiral Kethara. She broadcast to the remaining Zilanian survivors. Stand by for first contact with an unknown species. Whatever happens next, remember that we called them here. We asked the stars for help. She paused, watching as more of the impossible creatures filled the space around their dying world. And something answered. The first thing that became clear to Admiral Kethara was that these Terrans understood combat in ways her people never had. As their living fleet descended toward Zilanian Prime, they moved with a coordination that spoke of countless generations of cooperative evolution. The massive creatures formed defensive positions around the smaller ones, while the pack hunters spread out in patterns that somehow reminded her of ocean predators she'd studied in her youth. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the lead vessel," Velan reported, his voice steady despite the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. "This is Captain Sarah Chen again," came the voice, still speaking flawless Zilanian. "We're about to begin our approach to your planet's surface. Fair warning, this is going to look violent." "That's because it is. My partner Tiamat here hasn't had a good fight in 3 years. And she's been grumpy about it." "Partner?" Kethara exchanged glances with her bridge crew. Were these Terrans somehow bonded to their creatures? The question was answered a moment later, when one of the largest entities began its descent toward the planet. Through the viewing port, Kethara could see that what she had mistaken for cities along the creature's sides were actually complex biological structures, organs, perhaps, or specialized chambers. But there were definitely artificial elements integrated seamlessly with the living tissue. Zilanian stations, you might want to adjust your sensors to pick up bioelectric signatures. Came another voice. This one, with a different accent. "I'm Commander Jake Morrison, and I've got about 300 of Earth's finest aboard various creatures down here. We're about to show these devourers what happens when they mess with someone from a planet where everything evolved to kill everything else." Kethara quickly ordered the sensor adjustment, and the results were staggering. Each of the massive creatures contained dozens, sometimes hundreds of life signs. But these weren't passengers in the traditional sense. The readings suggested some kind of symbiotic relationship between the beings and their riders. The first creature to enter Zilanian Prime's atmosphere was the one Captain Chen had called Tiamat, and Kethara had to grip her command console to keep from staggering as she watched it move. The entity was at least 5 kilometers long, with a body that seemed to shift between different forms as needed. In space, it had been streamlined like a ray or manta, but as it encountered the planet's atmosphere, appendages emerged from its body wings, tentacles, things that defied classification, and then it opened its mouth. The devourers had been spreading across the planet's largest continent when Tiamat arrived. These creatures had consumed entire worlds before, absorbing all organic matter they encountered and growing stronger with each meal. Nothing had ever stood against them successfully. But as Tiamat's maw opened wide enough to swallow a city block, something unprecedented happened. Instead of consuming the devourers, the massive creature began to sing. The sound came through the station's instruments as a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through every piece of metal on the bridge. But on the planet's surface, something extraordinary was happening to the devourers. They were slowing down. Some were even backing away. "Fascinating," came Captain Chen's voice over the comm. "Tiamat says they taste wrong. Too artificial. She's a purist when it comes to her diet." "Captain Chen," Admiral Kethara managed to say, finding her voice despite her amazement. "Are you saying that creature is intelligent?" A warm laugh came through the speakers. "Oh, Tiamat is brilliant. Smarter than me in most ways. She's been sailing through space for about 200 years now, and she's got opinions about everything. Right now, her opinion is that your devourers are an insult to proper organic life." As if summoned by the mention of her name, more information flooded the sensors. The massive creature wasn't just fighting the devourers, she was analyzing them. Specialized organs along her body were taking samples, testing their composition, learning their weaknesses, and she was sharing this information with the other creatures in the fleet. "All units, this is Tiamat's analysis," Captain Chen announced. "The devourers are a constructed bioweapon, not a natural species. They're vulnerable to specific sonic frequencies and certain biochemical compounds. Lucky for us, We brought exactly the right friends for this job. The second wave of creatures descended. And these were different from Tiamat. Smaller, more agile, but no less impressive. Kethara watched in fascination as beings that looked like a cross between jellyfish and rays swooped down from the upper atmosphere. As they moved, they released clouds of some kind of airborne substance. Wherever these clouds touched the devourers, the results were immediate and dramatic. The consuming plague that had devoured an entire planet began to dissolve, breaking down into component molecules that scattered harmlessly in the wind. "That's the Pacific Bloom Squadron," Commander Morrison's voice crackled over the comm. "Each of those beauties is bonded with a marine biologist who specializes in biochemical warfare. The devourers evolved to break down normal organic compounds, but they've never encountered Earth's deep ocean chemistry. Turns out they can't process certain types of extremophile proteins." A third group of creatures approached the planet, and these were the pack hunters Kethara had noticed earlier. They moved in coordinated groups of 6 or 8, each one the size of a small ship. But what caught her attention was the life support systems she had spotted earlier. They weren't life support at all. They were weapons platforms, integrated so seamlessly with the creature's biology that they appeared to be natural organs. "And here come the space wolves," came another voice, younger and more excited than the others. "Lieutenant Rodriguez here, riding my partner Fenris. We're about to show these artificial nasties what real predators look like." The pack hunters dove toward the largest concentrations of devourers with a ferocity that took Kethara's breath away. But they weren't just attacking randomly, they were herding the enemy, driving them into specific areas where other creatures waited. The coordination was perfect, as if each being in the fleet shared a collective consciousness. "How are they doing this?" Admiral Threnak's voice came over the comm from Station 3. "This level of coordination. It should be impossible across so many different species." Captain Chen's voice carried a note of pride as she answered. "Thousands of years of partnership, Admiral. When humanity first reached the stars, we didn't go alone. We brought our friends, all of them. Dogs, horses, dolphins, whales, even modified extremophile bacteria. And when we started encountering hostile environments and aggressive species out here, we learned to work together in ways our ancestors never imagined. The battle, if it could be called that, was essentially over within an hour. The devourers, which had consumed an entire world in just 3 days, were completely eliminated by creatures that treated the whole affair as if it were a routine cleanup operation. But what amazed Kethara most was what happened next. Instead of leaving, the Terran creatures began a new phase of their operation. The massive entities like Tiamat positioned themselves in orbit around the planet and began to repair it. Specialized organisms were released from their bodies, microscopic life forms that settled on the devastated surface and began the work of restoration. "We call it re-terraforming," Captain Chen explained as Kethara watched in wonder. "Though in this case, I suppose it would be re-Zelanian forming. My partner here has been collecting genetic samples from your planet since we arrived. Between her biological databases and our terraforming organisms, we should have your world back to livable condition in about 6 months." "But why?" Admiral Threnak asked the question that Kethara was thinking. "You don't know us. We called for help against the devourers, not for planetary restoration." There was a pause before Commander Morrison answered. "Admiral, can I ask you something? When your people first achieved spaceflight, what was the first thing you did?" Kethara thought back to her history lessons. "We explored. We mapped the nearby systems and established colonies." "Right. Exploration, expansion, claiming territory. That's how most species approach space." Morrison's voice took on a different tone, more serious. "Humanity did something different. When we first left Earth, we brought our entire ecosystem with us. Every ship that left our solar system carried representatives of thousands of different species, not as cargo or resources, but as partners." Another voice joined the conversation. This one with an accent Kethara couldn't identify. "This is Dr. Yuki Tanaka aboard the research vessel Cousteau's Dream." What Commander Morrison is trying to say is that humans learned long ago that survival in space isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about cooperation between species. Through the sensors, Kethara could see that the Terran creatures were still arriving. Wave after wave of them, each more incredible than the last. Some were clearly modified versions of Earth species. She could see the basic forms of creatures that resembled the predatory marine life from Zelanian oceans, but enhanced and adapted for space. Others were completely alien, yet somehow they all moved together as if they were parts of a single organism. "How many species are represented in your fleet?" she asked. Captain Chen's laugh was warm and infectious. "That's actually a really good question. Let me ask Tiamat." There was a pause. "She says she's lost count, but her current estimate is somewhere around 12,000 distinct species, plus about 2 million artificially created variants. 12,000 species. Working together. As partners, Kethara began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was first contact with a civilization that had achieved something her people had never even imagined. A true symbiotic relationship between intelligence and nature, between technology and biology. "Admiral," Velan said quietly, his voice full of awe. "I'm detecting massive biosignatures approaching from hyperspace. More ships, no. More creatures. Hundreds of them. That'll be the colony fleet," Dr. Tanaka said matter-of-factly. "Once word gets out about what happened here, every xenobiologist and ecosystem engineer in human space is going to want to study your planet. The Devourers may have destroyed your surface biosphere, but we can rebuild it better than it was before. Stronger, more resistant to future attacks." Admiral Kethara looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew. For the first time in days, she saw something other than despair in their eyes. Hope. Wonder. The realization that their people might not be extinct after all. "Captain Chen," she said formally, "on behalf of the surviving Zelanian population, I want to thank you for answering our call for help." "Admiral," came the reply. "You called the stars for help, and the stars sent you Earth's children. Welcome to the family." 6 months later, Admiral Kethara stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed orbital station, watching her world come back to life. The sight still took her breath away, every morning. Where once there had been barren wasteland and ash, now vast prairies of silver-leafed grass swayed in the wind. The seas, which had been lifeless chemical soup after the Devourer's feast, now teemed with new forms of marine life, some native to ancient Zelania, others gifted by Earth's vast biological library. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the surface," reported Commander Velan. He had adapted remarkably well to serving as liaison between the Zelanian survivors and their unexpected allies. "Dr. Tanaka says the atmospheric processors are ahead of schedule. We should have breathable air planet-wide within another month." Kethara nodded, but her attention was focused on the incredible sight beyond the viewing ports. 3 massive creatures were currently in orbit around Zelanian Prime, each one a living ecosystem unto itself. Tiamat, the first to arrive, had become something of a local legend among the surviving Zelanians. The ancient creature had taken a special interest in their world's restoration, contributing genetic material from hundreds of worlds she had visited over her centuries of existence. But it was the smaller vessels that truly amazed Kethara. Hundreds of them now moved between the orbital stations and the planet's surface, each one a unique partnership between human crew and evolved Earth creatures. She had learned that the humans called these beings symbiotes rather than ships, and the relationship between human and creature was so intimate that they sometimes seemed to share thoughts. "Admiral, Captain Chen is requesting permission to come aboard," Velan announced. "Of course. Have her meet me in conference room 3. Kethara made her way through the station's corridors, marveling at how much had changed in half a year. The sterile, military atmosphere of the original station had been transformed. Everywhere she looked, she saw examples of Terran biotechnology integrated with Zelanian engineering. Walls that breathed and filtered the air. Lighting that came from bioluminescent organisms. Even the corridors themselves seemed somehow more alive. Captain Sarah Chen was waiting when Kethara arrived, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a creature that Kethara had never seen before, roughly humanoid in shape but clearly not human. Its skin had a coral-like texture, and it moved with the fluid grace of something that had evolved in water. "Admiral, I'd like you to meet my partner Coral," Captain Chen said with a smile. "She's been helping with the oceanic restoration project." The creature Coral extended what might have been a hand, though it was webbed and covered in what looked like living barnacles. When Kethara touched it, she felt a gentle tingling sensation, and suddenly found herself understanding the creature's thoughts directly. Greetings, star swimmer of the vertical dwellers. Your ocean memory sings beautifully. Kethara jerked her hand back in surprise, and Captain Chen chuckled. Sorry, I should have warned you. Coral communicates through bioelectric fields. She's been learning about Zelanian ocean life from the genetic samples we've recovered. And she's a poet about it. I've never experienced anything like that, Kethara said, her voice filled with wonder. Is this how all your creatures communicate? Some of them. Each species has its own methods. The important thing is that we've learned to listen. Captain Chen gestured to chairs around the conference table, which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you today. As they sat down, Coral settled into what was obviously a specially designed chair that kept her skin moist. Captain Chen activated a holographic display that showed the Zelanian star system, but now it was populated with dozens of contacts that hadn't been there 6 months ago. This is what your system looks like now, Captain Chen said. 17 research stations, 8 mobile colonies, and about 300 individual creature ships, plus, of course, the terraforming operations on your planet and the 2 moons we've claimed for ecological research. Kethara studied the display with amazement. You've essentially colonized our entire system, temporarily, Captain Chen assured her. Most of these operations will wrap up within the next 2 years. But that's not why I'm here. Her expression grew more serious. Admiral, we've received reports about the Devourers appearing in other systems. 17 confirmed attacks in the past month alone. The blood drained from Kethara's face. 17? But you destroyed them completely here. How could there be more? Captain Chen exchanged a glance with Coral, and the creature's bioluminescent patches flickered in what Kethara was beginning to recognize as a pattern of concern. We've learned that the Devourers aren't a natural phenomenon, Captain Chen explained. They're a weapon system, created by an ancient civilization that apparently believed the galaxy was becoming too crowded with organic life. Someone is still manufacturing them and releasing them to target specific worlds. Kethara's heart sank. The idea that someone was deliberately unleashing these horrors, that Zelanian Prime had been specifically chosen for destruction, was almost too terrible to contemplate. However, Captain Chen continued, we think we've found a solution. It's unconventional. Unconventional. At this point, I've learned not to question Terran unconventionality, Kethara said, with a weak smile. Captain Chen activated another section of the holographic display. This time it showed what looked like a vast network of energy signatures spread across multiple star systems. We call it the Symbiosis Protocol, she explained. Instead of just responding to Devourer attacks after they happen, we're proposing to establish a galaxy-wide early warning system. Paired human creature teams stationed in key systems, sharing information through bio-quantum entanglement networks. Kethara studied the display more carefully. You're talking about a defensive alliance. But why involve other species? Your creatures are clearly capable of handling the Devourers alone. Coral's patches flickered again, and Captain Chen smiled. That's exactly what Coral said. She wants me to tell you about the deep swimming. The what? Captain Chen leaned forward, her eyes taking on the same intense focus Kethara had seen in all the Terrans when they discussed their creatures. On Earth, there's an ocean trench called the Mariana Deep. For millions of years, creatures lived down there in complete isolation from the surface world. They evolved incredible abilities: pressure, resistance, chemosynthesis, bioluminescence, but they were limited by their environment. She gestured to Coral, who responded with a complex pattern of light and color across her skin. When humans first reached the deep ocean, we could have simply studied these creatures and left them alone. Instead, we formed partnerships. We gave them access to the surface world, to space, to environments they never could have reached alone. In return, they gave us capabilities we never could have developed independently. Understanding began to dawn on Kethara. You're saying that the Devourers aren't just a threat, they're an opportunity. Exactly. Every species that survived a Devourer attack has developed unique defensive capabilities. The Krithari in the Vega system have evolved armor that's stronger than any material we've ever seen. The Meloid Collective has developed predictive algorithms that can forecast Devourer attack patterns months in advance. The crystalline entities near the galactic core generate energy fields that disrupt Devourer feeding mechanisms. Captain Chen stood and walked to the viewing ports, looking out at the bustling activity around Zelanian Prime. Your people survived because you had the courage to call for help. Most species try to face the Devourers alone, and they die alone. But you reached out to the stars, and the stars sent you. Kethara finished quietly. Not just us. The stars sent the possibility of something bigger. Captain Chen turned back to face her. Admiral, what if the next time someone calls for help against the Devourers, they don't just get Earth's creatures? What if they get a response from Zelanian bioengineers who know how to purify corrupted ecosystems? From Krithari warriors riding armored space whales? From Meloid strategists partnered with crystalline energy manipulators? The scope of what Captain Chen was proposing took Kethara's breath away. Not just an alliance between species, but a true symbiotic network spanning the galaxy, each member contributing their unique capabilities while gaining access to the abilities of all the others. The Symbiosis Protocol, Kethara said slowly. You're not just talking about defending against the Devourers, you're talking about a new kind of civilization. Coral's bioluminescence pulsed in what Kethara had learned was approval, and Captain Chen nodded. Humanity learned something important when we first left Earth. The universe is vast and dangerous, and no single species, no matter how advanced, can face it alone. But together, we can handle anything. Over the following weeks, Admiral Kethara found herself at the center of the most ambitious diplomatic project in galactic history. Representatives from dozens of species arrived at Zelanian Prime, each bringing stories of their own encounters with the Devourers and their unique solutions to the threat. The Krithari delegation arrived aboard creatures that looked like living asteroids, their crystalline shells providing perfect protection against Devourer feeding mechanisms. The Meloid Collective sent a ship that was less a vessel than a flying ecosystem, with hundreds of different species working in perfect harmony. The energy beings from the galactic core didn't send ships at all, they simply appeared as patterns of light that danced around the orbital stations. But what amazed Kethara most was how naturally these diverse species began to work together once the Terrans introduced the concept of symbiosis. The humans, it seemed, had a gift for seeing the potential connections between different forms of life. Within days, Krithari armor technicians were working alongside Meloid bioengineers to develop new defensive systems. Energy beings were teaching human navigators how to manipulate hyperspace in ways that would have taken centuries to discover independently. I've been thinking about something, Captain Chen said. Admiral Threnak mentioned during one of their planning sessions. He had been studying reports from the various alliance members, his expression thoughtful. She said that when humans first reached the stars, they brought their entire ecosystem with them, not as resources, but as partners. Kethara looked up from her own reports. Yes, it's an unusual approach to space colonization. No, that's not what I mean. Threnak activated a holographic display showing the current state of their system. Look at this. In 6 months, they've turned our dead system into the most biologically diverse region in this arm of the galaxy. But they're not keeping it for themselves. They're sharing it with everyone. Not. Kethara studied the display more carefully and realized what he meant. Every species that had joined the Alliance had contributed something to Zelanian Prime's restoration. The Krithari had provided mineral processors that enriched the soil. The Meloids had introduced atmospheric balancing organisms. The energy beings had shown them how to tap stellar radiation in ways that accelerated plant growth. They're not building an empire, she said quietly. They're building a garden. Exactly. And they're inviting everyone to help tend it. As if summoned by their conversation, Captain Chen's voice came over the comm system. All station commanders. This is the Darwin's dream. We've just received a priority transmission from the Andromeda sector. Multiple Devourer incursions reported across 17 systems. The Hegemony Council is requesting immediate assistance. Admiral Kethara smiled as she activated her communicator. For the first time since the Devourers had appeared at Zelanian Prime, she felt something other than fear when hearing about their attacks. This is Admiral Kethara to all Alliance vessels, she announced. Prepare for deployment. Let's show the galaxy what happens when someone calls the stars for help. As the great creatures began to stir and gather around Zelanian Prime, preparing for their next mission, Kethara reflected on how much had changed. 6 months ago, her people had been facing extinction. Now they were part of something vast and wonderful, a network of species learning to face the universe together. The Devourers were still out there, still threatening worlds across the galaxy. But they were no longer facing isolated civilizations fighting alone in the dark. They were facing the combined strength of hundreds of species who had learned the most important lesson in the universe. Sometimes, the best way to survive is to help others survive too. And in the vast network of partnerships that now stretched across the galaxy, that lesson was becoming the foundation of something unprecedented, a truly symbiotic civilization where the strength of all became the strength of each. The stars had indeed sent help. But more than that, they had sent hope.